Okay, Tom.
Okay, are you ready? Okay, let's call this meeting to order at approximately 4 minutes after 4 on the 8th of December. Let's begin with approval of minutes from the October 13th, 2015 meeting, which apparently we have just been presented with.
I've looked at them and I'll move their approval.
I will second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Negative? Oh, okay. Motion passes. Oh, okay. Old business. I was not here at the last meeting, and so
At the bottom, you have to slide all the way down. You'll probably find the attachments.
Yeah, well, I've got the attachments
Oh, okay.
on paper here too, and I agree, but and I'm a little bit confused here, and maybe you could kind of help me on this a little bit.
Absolutely.
The Crosswind Runway Focused Planning Study Update is it's listed as old business, but isn't that new business really?
No, I think.
Mr. Chair, that was discussed at the last meeting.
It was discussed at the last meeting.
So this
Okay,
isn't-
Right.
So that's why it's listed that way.
Yeah,
All
this
right.
is
And-
kind of an
and now-
update to that from that last meeting.
And that's what this is. Part of this is that, I presume. And it was discussed. Okay,
Yep.
we'll let it go at that. And then a presentation of the modified runway 927 alternative, somewhere along that got presented at the last meeting as well.
That is correct, yep. And then we do have our consultant, Meaden Hunt, here to provide an update on that.
Okay, and so, well, fine, if that's been done. Any additions or corrections to that? All right. New business, consider approval.
Mr. Chair, we do have Meaden Hunt here. They do have some updates
Oh,
they'd like
you
to
do
go
have
through.
some
Yep.
updates?
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe.
wouldn't that be under new business?
No.
No,
We're
it's
just
old
updating the old
Old
business.
business.
Because
They're
we did it
updating old
last-
business.
Yeah, maybe if I could just take a quick opportunity, maybe to
Okay.
kind of bring some clarity to it, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
This is a little confusing because I missed the last meeting. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. We'll catch everybody up here. This is Brian Page. I'm with Meaden Hunt, the consultant for the airport. And tonight I have Rob Sims with me, one of our lead planners for the work going on in the focus planning study for runway 927. At the last meeting in October, we had came with the presentation of the options and basically the draft final report for the different alternatives. And at the meeting, the commission had raised some questions at that point about just the location and about the possibility of sliding the orientation of that runway to the point that we weren't going to have any sort of conflicts, particularly with two things of note. One of them, if you look at one of the drawings, you can kind of see where the new school site is going to be located, and you can kind of see all the different parts of the school. Well, one of the things that we were asked to look at is the prior alternative showed that Zone B is actually dipping into or going past that roadway, not very much, but just a little bit, and to the point, could we slide the runway a little bit further west in order to avoid that and still stay away from County Highway or County Road 12, which is off to the west of the current trapezoidal areas. So that was really the reason, and what we wanted to do is bring that to the commission tonight and show that, yes, that could be done. And Rob, in a minute, will talk a little bit about the details and some of the particulars associated with changing that orientation. It works, but Rob can kind of better explain a little bit of some of the differences there. One of the other things that we were asked to look at is on the other side of Highland Avenue, there's a small portion, a triangular portion on the east side of that yellow trapezoidal area. that there was some concerns that if that area is eventually annexed into the city, what could be done with that area to actually lay it out that would allow some housing development to go into that area, but still also abide by the state's restrictions for Zone B. And those were the two specific items that we were asked to look at back in October. So with that, I'm going to kind of turn this over to Rob, and Rob's got kind of a short presentation to kind of walk you through and explain it, and then answer any questions that you might have.
Sure. So I am Rob Sims. I'm also with Mead and Hunt, and I've got just a few slides and a few minutes for you. It's pretty short. So first off, just to review real quick, if you see that slide on the top right, the one that's up here on the screen, that's the alternative that we discussed last time and agreed to, and we're going to move forward with, but we did have a few changes to it. And we were also asked to look at the zoning in a little more detail. So that alternative right there to the west, it stops right before County Road 12, and to the east it goes slightly over around the North Highland Ave area and into the school that's currently under construction. So we had a couple zoning options on the next slide there that we were discussed a little bit last time, and we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. The first one is the one that we're going to be looking at right now, the development clusters. All right, so if we take a closer look here at Alternative 8, what we were examining during our last meeting, you can see on Alternative 8, road stops on the west side before County Road 12 and goes kind of into the school area there, like I mentioned. The changes that we made to it in Alternative 9 are slight. It's modified Alternative 8, but just clarity, we're going to call it Alternative 9. On the west side, it's exactly the same, stops right before County Road 12. And on the east side, we pulled it back 80 feet, which is enough to halt before it actually goes over into the school area. That 80 feet is 80 feet of the runway. It's actually 100 feet, 160 feet of the zone there. But by shortening the runway 80 feet, that brings up a couple issues, though, that we need to discuss. And the first of which is the actual length of the runway. So if you remember from some prior presentations we've done, and also a lot of the alternatives that we've come up with have been built around 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet is the recommended length as per FAA guidance, or 3,300 feet, excuse me, is the recommended length based on FAA guidance for this runway. And so by shortening it 80 feet, we have to ask ourselves a few things. You know, how does that impact the runway? Will it change what aircraft can use it? The way this 3,300 feet is come up with, essentially, it's the FAA looking at a group of aircraft and then categorically saying, what are the general performance needs of this aircraft? Now here, it doesn't apply specifically to the airport and the aircraft that are here. So there is some flexibility with it. It is a recommendation, not necessarily a hard line in the sand. What is, however, more of a hard line in the sand and a very strong recommendation is what you need for an instrument approach. And so by giving up that 80 feet, we're still at over 3,200 feet. So the length of the runway, 3,220 feet. And we would be above what we need for the minimum length required for an approach procedure. And that's something that we were looking at, you know, the possibility of growing into that in the future. And the second part that you would gain that's not actually on the slide is you would be able to move that development restrictions off of the school area. So those are the two things you gain by giving up the 80 feet. All right, and then just a little bit of detail here on how exactly the development in that Zone B works. So the development in Zone B typically is a 3-acre minimum site. So, you know, do the simple math. If the Zone B is normally about 30 acres, you could usually only fit about 10 different sites in there at 3 acres each, probably less considering how the spacing of it would work. Whereas if you look at it and decide to do a cluster development, it's based on the entirety of the site, and instead of having a relatively large plots that are spread about a relatively large amount of area, you have them all focused into one area. For this specific example, these are the guidance, that table there on the right. It's probably a little small to read in the print off, but maybe you can make it off and I'll read it off to you. Basically, for a certain amount of size that we're looking at, in this case, 32 acres for the entirety of Zone B, we would go to the associate category. Site acre is greater than 20, which is the largest, and in turn that allows us to have a maximum building area of, it hasn't square feet there, but it's basically 5 acres. And so by looking at this and calling it an entire zone, this means that we can basically develop 5 acres within that Zone B area. So the next slide, I know it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of things flying around. It's maybe slightly confusing if you're not already acquainted with it. So this is an illustrative concept of what that could look like. If we have the entirety of Zone B right here, that top right corner north of Highland Ave, that's just shy of 5 acres that's used up there to put in 11 different plots. So if you compare the possibility of probably somewhere around 9 developments in the traditional fashion versus this, where 11, and you could, reconfigure it to have somewhere around 12 likely development areas in it. So this is really just an illustrative purpose. You can move it around as much as you would desire, but the point to take away is that this would allow you to develop 5 acres of that. The rest of that is not actively developed to be a residential area. You do have a few other uses you could use there. You would have the agricultural use or possibly a park, depending on what you decided to put in there. So that's just the concept laid out. If there's any questions, be happy to address them.
Makes good sense.
Okay, great.
I think, for planning purposes, that would be basically a cluster of lots,
Exactly
with
right.
houses on them, and everything else is wide open.
In this, there's
Pretty
a couple
much.
different ways you could take it, but yes, pretty much wide open. You could have, a park or agricultural use. You would have some options, but as far as where you could develop a residential clustered area, this would be what it would look like.
But the rest of the area, other than that, where those lots are, would be free of structures?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
All right,
I'm
thank you.
looking at,
Oh, yeah.
I'm looking at, if this is labeled. I get the best view here on the computer. And I'm on Exhibit 4-9. Is the best labeling I see on it. I think it's page 4.
Back here.
It's right after page 2 of 3, 3 of 3, and then comes a attachment. The best label of which I see is Exhibit 4-9.
Are you referring to the memo or the,
Yeah,
Slides.
it's attached. It's attached to the memo.
oh, that one, okay.
Yeah, commission members, it'd be page 5 of your PDF file that's on the computer, and that's the
Okay.
site description or the layout of the proposed crosswind runway.
What is it, Mark, 4-9?
Yeah. Yeah, keep going
Keep going in, keep going down.
up.
Exhibit 4.9.
Right there.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay. On that exhibit, so the area that you're talking about, the potential development is in that upper left-hand corner of safety zone B, right?
That's correct.
Across Highland from that is some additional property that is also owned by Belters. What could be developed in there?
Well, the way this site would work is that since the whole thing is 32 acres, that means you have 5 acres to develop. And the configuration would be up to you, really. I mean, it would be something that you could decide on.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, in this example that I laid out, this developed area that's north of that road, it's actually 4.75, I believe it is, acres, but it's just shy of 5 acres. And so that means you do actually have a little bit of extra room where you could put another plot on the other side. But it is flexible, though. There isn't any hard, fast rule as to what would be right there.
So
What's-
when you say this is just an example,
Mhm.
somebody could choose to develop less housing on the, make sure I get my directions right, on the north, no, on the east, be the northeast side of Highland right there.
That's correct.
But they then could put more over on the southwest side of Highland right there.
Yes.
So someplace in that approximately 5 acres, that's about how many they could develop. This is just an example.
Right, you could move it around as you would like.
So some development is allowed in that zone.
That's correct.
If I might be able to, just kind of bring a couple of additional tidbits of information. What the restriction for Zone B is it's a 15-to-1 ratio, meaning that the population in that cluster, in that area, just cannot result or cannot exceed a population of more than 15 people per acre that's going in there. So that's hence the reason for the cluster. But the reason for going through this exercise was the concerns that were expressed at the time about, can something be done with that area, not to have that area just become vacant land, if you would? What can maximize the city's benefit to that land, and what could be done? And the main upshot that Rob and his team have come up with here is showing an alternative or a layout. But this isn't meant to say
Right.
that this has to be how it would be. But the main upshot would be is, yes, there is some things that could be done there, and it would certainly meet the city's expectations for that area. It's just that you would have to kind of approach it a little bit more in a kind of a little bit more of a mindful process of making sure that, hey, there is some airport zoning here that we need to be aware of.
As we press ahead with this, some of this is land that we have to acquire.
Mhm.
Some of it is land that we don't acquire, but the land is impacted by these zones. The impacted land, for example, the kind we're talking about right now, is there any compensation to those landowners for the impact of the new restrictions that arguably weren't there yesterday?
There is going to be some land that's going to need to be acquired on both ends, obviously, of the runway, in addition to where the runway alignment, frankly, would be going off to the west of where the for current fee simple boundary is. And if there is any diminution in value of that property or of that parcel, certainly I think, the expectation is going to be there that there would be some justification for compensation for those parcels. So that would be something you have to look at. There is a clear zone requirement. We talked a little bit about that at the meeting back in October, and there is going to be a clear zone that is going to come along with both ends of the runway, that it would have to be acquired out as a fee simple boundary and have title to that property for a certain distance. But then beyond that, it would be more or less on depending on the type of an approach that it is it going to have an instrument approach, and what kind of runway characteristics are going to come with it? Then it kind of gets a little bit more, more or less customized to whatever type of an approach is going to be on that runway. But the upshot to it is there's something that can work in that area, and certainly there is quite a bit of land acquisition and easement work that would need to be done. The process, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit about the capital improvement process, but there is a lot of things that would have to fall
You
into place.
just mentioned easement. Is this the kind of thing that requires easement from these property owners?
Some can be
Safety
easement.
zones?
Some of it can be. Some of it is required to be in fee simple. Like, say, for instance, the clear zone area off the end of the runway. That's going to be required to be in fee simple. There is some areas that if it falls inside of an approach zone, just so you have clear access and clear, or I guess control over that property, that there would be some easement that may extend even beyond where those fee simple boundaries lie.
You keep talking about an approach zone. Are you talking about an instrument approach?
We're not talking about instrument approaches right now, but as Rob has mentioned, the significance of keeping this runway, and the runway length right now is at 3,220 feet.
Yeah.
Anything greater than 3,200 feet would be eligible to develop an instrument approach, and you can have an instrument approach to the runway of that 3,200 length. So not to say that's how this runway would be opened and how it would be pursued. It could, but right now, the proposal is such that just keeping the options available for this runway and going through this process that it could happen.
What if we decided that, no, we really don't need that? Would that change anything?
Need the instrument approach?
Yeah, if we said, no, we can just use the instrument approaches that we've got on 1.5 and 3.3 now with circle to land if necessary. I mean, you're never gonna, on something like that, you're never gonna be able to do a tight instrument approach anyway.
Right.
And so, I mean, the approach minimums would be so high for coming over all of that, you know, an instrument approach is almost worthless anyway. I question whether it would even be worthwhile to try to do that. I mean, but then there's my additional question is, if it's not worth it, does that impact what we're trying to do here?
No, as far as
It does not?
No, as far as the zoning and what's in place and in the drawings and in the exhibit, either on page 5 or else the 4-9, it really doesn't have any impact, you know,
Okay.
on what's being proposed as far as the initial project is concerned. It's just a matter of being able to keep your runway eligible, or I guess at least positioned to where it could get those approaches down the road. But realistically, like you said, the instrument approaches coming into a runway of that size, does it make sense? I don't know, but that's not what's being proposed here.
Okay.
It's essentially just gonna be a visual type runway. And in essence, and the purpose of it is to really kind of, as we've talked about at some of the previous meetings, to maintain that wind coverage for the airport. That right now, the wind coverage on the primary runway in and of itself does not provide the minimum required wind coverage that the FAA requires at 95%. So you have the crosswind runway, but the existing crosswind runway has existing problems with some of the development of, well, primarily both sides, and we talked a little bit about there, waded through that. If we look at expanding it in the future on its existing alignment, there's issues with that. It's better just to change the alignment to go to this one and then basically remain and keep what you have and keep a crosswind runway to be able to provide that all-weather coverage or all-wind coverage for the airport. So that's the main upshot of what we're trying to do with this runway 927 alignment.
Okay, and one more question here. What is the approximate distance from the east end of that runway to the outer edge of the safety zone? I guess that'd be B.
The definition of zone A and B, basically A is going to be 2/3 of the runway length, and
Okay.
then zone B is going to be for the additional third. So essentially, if you total up the two of them, you're essentially looking at the same distance of
Okay.
whatever it is that you're trying to protect.
Okay,
for.
so it'd be about 3,200 feet,
Correct.
about a runway length then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I've got a question somewhat related. With the shortened runway, is there an overrun area that can be developed so that it doesn't impact if an aircraft should overrun with collapsible concrete, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
latest thing is, that doesn't impact the safety zone, so we can still maintain that safety zone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think what you may be referring to is what they call EMAS, and basically it's a low-strength type concrete. And you see this at a lot of very urbanized type airports and urbanized settings that space really becomes an issue. That, for instance, Minneapolis has an EMAS on, I forget which runway exactly it is, but they have basically a main boulevard that's just off to the end of this runway approach. But essentially the idea is when the aircraft enters this, it's designed as such that the gear will actually dig into this concrete, and by the nature of the friction, that actually slows the aircraft and brings it to a stop. Could it be considered here? It could be. but it's probably not the right setting or right application for it in the sense that the purposes of the various different zonings, the Zone A and the Zone B, are really meant for that purpose.
Okay.
Is to give an aircraft enough of a room and enough of a chance that if there's something going wrong on takeoff or landing, that it gives them an additional space that's clear of any sort of obstructions. And that's quite frankly why in Zone A, the restrictions in Zone A are such that no structures or nothing can be allowed in Zone A. And the reasons for that is for that intended purpose. That if there's any sort of digression from the runway, that it gives them an opportunity to basically come to a full rest without, creating much more damage to the aircraft.
I'm just looking at that, if it should overrun, it could impact the other runway if it kept going and suddenly collapsed on the runway. And that's what tried to keep it from actually reaching that area. And that was the question I had. Can that something,
Sure.
at least on the one side, so that it would not reach the other runway?
Sure. The alternatives that we'll need to look at, maybe it'd be best characterized in the next steps beyond here and the things that we'll look at, which that will be something that will be considered moving forward. But the first step here is to really get to an alternative that it looks like, yes, this is the alternative that's going to work for the community. It's meeting your expectations as to runway length and where it fits in the grander scheme of things, that you're bookend on both sides by public roads, essentially. So it fits inside there, but the next step would be is to move forward with the environmental process. And in the environmental process, we have to look at a lot of different options. Rob and I are involved in one right now, for example, at another airport of similar size and nature, and we're looking at 10 different alternatives. One of them is considering EMAS and looking at, okay, if we put this in, how does that change the overall picture? But the main upshot right now is to get an alternative that we're going to advance and move forward with, knowing that there's some more planning and some more things that will need to be done environmentally down the road. So really the purpose of tonight's discussion is to review this option that we looked at and brought before the commission in October, and to gain consensus from the Airport Commission in general that yes, this is a preferred option. I think the next step, my conversations with Steve were that the next steps would be is to take this to City Council and look for City Council approval on this option once the commission has agreed to it. So that's really what we were hoping to do tonight, is to be able to get that consensus. Or is there something else that we need to be looking at here? So
You're looking for a motion to approve this modification to the earlier alternative we approved. I would so move.
I will second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
I don't have any.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any negative? No. Motion passes.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go on to new business. Consider approval of request for proposal for electrical on-call contract.
okay, Mr. Chairman, if I think I'll just stay up here and kind of move through this and give some background on it. This is something that Steve and I have talked about, and Joe have talked about over the last year or so. And the purpose of what we're looking to do here is the city has got a pretty big investment out there at the airport, and particularly with the lighting and the navigational aids and approach lights that were just put in. A lot of moving parts out there that right now there isn't any sort of a contractor or anybody that's really watching over what's happening out there. Collectively, the city's probably got well over $1 million invested out there. So what Steve and I have talked about, and I kind of mentioned to Steve that I've seen this in a lot of other communities where what they will do is solicit what's called an on-call services agreement with a qualified electrical contractor that understands this equipment, and solicit proposals to come in And then you can decide as a commission which one of them makes sense based on their qualifications and maybe even based on some references of getting a qualified contractor on an on-call agreement. That if something happens with the approach lights or something happens with the PAPIs or the reels aren't working or maybe the runway lights aren't working, that at least you got somebody to call that can be up here on an on-call services basis. And possibly, I've seen it where they even put right in there that the response time has to be within a certain time limit to get them out there and get you back working again in relatively quick order. So it's something that you have the on-call and you'll have to set up some sort of an agreement with that contractor, and maybe they use it, maybe they don't, but at least you got that kind of insurance that somebody is on board out there that if you need them, they can get you out there and get you working again in pretty short order. There's several contractors in the area. Several good ones. I'm personally aware of a pretty good one that's down in Mankato. The contractor that put in the system out there at the airport is relatively close, over near Minneapolis. They could certainly and probably would look at, the agreement, but it starts with the commission seeing the need to do it and then putting out the advertisement, which is shown here and it should have been in your packet. Getting the advertisement out and soliciting these proposals to come in, and then you can evaluate them as to which one makes sense for the city.
I would really support that idea because I've been exposed to that. I mean, actually, I think I'm the only one in the group that flies very much. And especially when they installed the new lights, I mean, I'm sure you're well aware, there were a lot of problems. And I would sort of humbly disagree with you that those people that installed those lights, I wasn't as impressed with them as you apparently were. That stuff didn't work very well for quite a while. Sorry about that. I know several, I live here, I know a lot of the local contractors. I think the response would have been a lot better. But, we'll see.
Sure.
But something needs to be done about that. I totally agree with you that it's time to do something with that. And, I mean, I don't understand that stuff, but, I want it to work.
Right.
I mean, there's, nothing like having the lights go out in the middle of an instrument approach or something like that.
Right.
So I guess do we need? I guess we need some kind of something a proposal, I guess, for to pass on to the city council that they think about that, or that would be the appropriate thing to do.
Mr. Chair, a few of the things that were listed in here, on the front page, you see submittal requirements.
Okay.
And these are just some suggestions. You may have some other ones that you may want to put in there. But a lot of these things would be more or less the garden variety things that you should be looking for. Such as, a list of who it is that's actually going to be working on this stuff and what their credentials are. Do they understand the system? Do they understand what they're looking at? That would probably be one of the most important things. Any sort of references that you're getting, have they worked at airports before? I mean, do they understand if you tell them or ask them to work on a PAPI or a reel or a MALS-F system? Do they know what you're talking about, to begin with? Some of those things. You may think of some other things. There's no, I guess if they need to be added here, so be it. But the main upshot would be is to have somebody on board that can respond in a relatively quick amount of time if something goes wrong.
We have a
Motion.
motion out yet?
Vote on it and stuff.
You have a motion?
Someone should make a motion, I think.
I make the motion that we put out for tender a request for proposal for the electrical on-call contract for this New Ulm Airport.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any commentary?
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Right.
Any negative? Motion passes. Okay. Got that done. Is consider recommending the development of a wildlife hazard management plan. Uh, You know, I've got a really good story on that one. I have an employee who is a recreational flyer, and he had an airplane over in some small town east of here. I can't remember which town it was now. And believe it or not, he hit a deer just as he was flaring to land, and it destroyed the airplane. Fortunately, he survived it okay, but it destroyed the deer too. There were many he took pictures of it, and there were many pieces of the deer strung along the runway, but it did so much damage that they just junked the airplane. It did a lot of structural damage, and for those of you who have never been involved in anything like this, anytime you have a propeller strike, the engine has to be torn down, and that is not a cheap thing to do.
Yeah, right.
And it also did a lot of damage on the exterior of the airplane, and so they just junked it, and he went and bought another airplane. So, but it could have been a real disaster. And so, yeah, we should do that. But you know, the guys out here at the airport, they actively work at controlling critters who, I'm sure you're aware of this. They control critters who dig big holes in, badgers particularly like to dig big holes out there. And if you ever dropped a nose wheel into one of those badger holes, you'd probably do some serious damage. So, and it's probably time to think about a perimeter fence at the airport.
Absolutely.
And that will not be cheap.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, that's a very good point. The project, and this kind of will fold a little bit into talking about the capital improvement program, but essentially one of the projects that has been carried in the CIP, or capital improvement program, for a couple of years is putting in a new deer fence or wildlife fence around certain key parts of the airport. And a lot of that is really kind of being driven by a lot of the comments from the users, from Dan. Has mentioned that several times at the airport, that the deer have been kind of coming back with a vengeance, and a lot of deer out there at the airport, and looking to try to do something just to make it a little bit more safer operating environment for the users. Now, one of the things as far as the CIP planning is concerned is this is a federally eligible project to do it, but it can only be done after there is first what's called a wildlife hazard assessment, that you have somebody come in and take a look at it, a certified wildlife biologist, come out there and look at what's going on at the airport, maybe offer some ideas, but that evolves into what's called this wildlife hazardous management plan. And that is actually the plan as to how you're going to address whatever kind of issue is going on, whether it's deer, or if it's a lot of times we get migratory waterfowl, that become issues. If you're getting burrowing, type animals, any badgers, any gophers, things like that. But all that stuff needs to be addressed, and that's how that plan will come into play. Once the plan is developed, part of that plan will be a recommendation that there be some sort of fencing, put around certain key parts of the airport, wherever the deer pattern and so forth, or whatever the wildlife pattern happens to be, and something to address it. So this is really kind of part of putting a plan in motion that will lead to that fencing down the road, but it's first things first. You get the plan done, then move into the fencing. So that's really what the wildlife hazardous management plan is all about. One of the things that we can look at doing is, in this state, the U.S. Department of Ag does these type surveys, and it's quite possible that maybe they can provide that service for the city. and come out and do it through a government program. And that's something that Steve and I have talked about, and we're going to explore that a little bit more to see if they can come out and get that done for New Ulm. So, but the idea would be is to move forward with doing the plan, and that's the reason.
Did I hear you say that FAA would not approve the fencing without first doing the assessment?
Correct. They would not find the fencing to be eligible without having the wildlife hazard assessment done. And that came straight from the program manager through FAA.
In the assessment, I guess somebody would ask local pilots, ask Dan what he sees, or what? What would constitute a $70,000 assessment?
Part of it would be the interviews, but the other part of it would be as observation, that you would actually have a biologist that would probably come out here, camp out there for a while and observe, you know, as to what's happening.
I ain't no biologist, but I could observe just as good as any one of them. And if we approve that budget, I'm
Sure.
putting in for the $70,000. It ain't funny.
We'll take that down.
Jeez, what a goddamn waste of money. Christ.
I disagree, having been on the receiving end of a number of wildlife incidents during my flying career, and one last week. I had a bird strike on my coming into land. Spent the night on an airport cot as a result. So, I think it'd be
Fencing probably wouldn't have helped.
not on that one, but on another one. Yes, it would have.
And maybe just a little bit of a correction, I guess, of what's shown. I mean, as far as the cost is concerned, the cost isn't really, I mean, that's just an estimate as to what it's gonna take. And that's really not what's supposedly on the agenda for tonight. It's more or less to move forward with the plan. And quite possibly, if the U.S. Department of Ag can do it for you, my guess is it's gonna be done at a pretty, it's not gonna be free, but it'll be at a pretty good discount.
Well, I will make the motion that we go ahead and do this assessment.
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second that we go ahead with a wildlife assessment because it's the only way to begin this project. We've already had some discussion. Any other discussion?
Mark, now's your time to get another comment in.
Much more to say. Pretty obvious.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All against? Motion passes. Okay, last thing on the agenda, review preliminary 2016 SIP for ULM. Report attached. Now, this is preliminary, right?
Yes.
In other words, we're just, now what happens to this now? If we approve it, does it just kind of, do we just move it on to the city council, or how?
If I might be able to interject, Mr. Chairman, the capital improvement programming process is, this is a living document that MnDOT holds for you in their state system, if you would, that essentially maps out and plans for what it is you plan to do as an airport or a city moving forward with your airport for the next. Primarily, they want you to focus on the next 5 years, but they've also asked to look and project out even beyond that 5 years, and that's why you see things going out on this CIP all the way to 2039, although most of it is just pavement maintenance beyond the next 5 years. The most important part of it is to look at what you're doing for next year, for next fiscal year, That is the most key part of it. And just to explain a little bit about the process, for instance, looking into next year for 2016, the things that show up in the CIP is the environmental update for the crosswind runway. Depending on if City Council approves it, the next step will be is to do that environmental update to be able to advance the project through the NEPA process. The next part will be to update the master plan and ALP, which would need to be updated as part of that. And then as we talked about just briefly just before was the wildlife hazard assessment and also the hazardous management plan. You also see zoning update and hangar restoration and hangar storage facility in there, but those are both two state projects. The federal process, the federal fiscal year has already started for fiscal year 2016. The next milestone event will occur coming up next week, as a matter of fact, on December 15th. That what they ask for is they ask for all municipalities to submit what's called the pre-application process, which is basically a letter of intent or a notice of intent of what you plan to do. You're not obligated at that point, but it's putting your, I guess, interest out there in the sense before the feds and before the state officials that, yes, this is what you plan to do and projects that you plan to advance. In the spring of next year, it'll probably be, from what I'm hearing, as early as March. They will ask for the full application come through from the city to advance these projects and to be able to apply for the federal grants that you're looking for to be able to help compensate you for each one of those projects. So it starts with advancing or approving the CIP, that yes, this is in alignment with what it is that you plan to do. And then the next steps will be again, as I mentioned, next week will be the pre-application process, followed by the application process coming up in the spring of 2016. So.
So I guess we need to at least just put our approval on this and move it on then to the council.
Yes.
So I need a motion and a second on this, please.
Well, I'll make a motion that for the preliminary 2016 CIP for we approve it.
You want it for just 16, or do you want it as written?
Mr. Chair, if I could interject here quick, it's the 2016 CIP report, which includes everything listed.
Okay,
So
I just wanted to make sure we weren't limiting ourselves.
Yep, that's the report
16.
in its entirety. Yep.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the CIP for 2016. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Against? Motion carries. Okay. Next meeting, January 12th. How's that date look?
I would not be able to attend if it's the 12th. I have a conflict. I have another meeting at 4 that day.
It's a Tuesday again, right?
Tuesday.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, I won't be here either. I'll be,
Mr. Chairman, if it helps, I think the meeting in January, I don't think has any time-sensitive decisions. The next time-sensitive decision really will come from City Council to advance the alternative.
okay,
And of course with the CIP as well. So if the 12th doesn't work, I don't think there's anything that I can think of right now that would be time-sensitive.
okay, well,
And Mr. Chair, we can certainly keep you in loop if any items do come up that would need attention in January. But we can just kind of keep in touch as we move forward
okay.
and go from there.
Okay, you can call. Steve knows how to find me, so.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, well, I'm gonna be busy conducting experiments in vertical acceleration on snow, so.
Hopefully there's some snow to conduct those.
Oh, yeah, there is in Colorado.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Council.
Sure.
We have to make a motion
Thanks.
to adjourn.
Oh, yeah, we guess we do, we need a motion for adjournment, you're right, thank you.
I so move.
I second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. All in favor?
Meeting is
Meeting is
closed.
adjourned.
Thank you.